Okay, I think it's time to start. So let's begin the second session here. We're looking at motivational and attentional balance. The first session we looked at motivational balance, and this second session now we'll have a look at attentional balance. In this second session, we'll begin with a meditation. We'll do a Shamatha Practice, Mindfulness of Breathing, full body version. We'll do a short review after the meditation of some of the main points from the first session. Then we'll look at attentional balance, what it is, the imbalances and how to correct them. And in that respect, from a Buddhist perspective, we'll look at the shamatha training. And then we'll do another meditation, mindfulness of breathing, and the second one focusing on the abdomen. And then time for some question answer at the end of the session. With the attentional balance training or shamatha practice in Buddhism, the most common object that is used, that's recommended, is the breath, mindfulness of breathing. The number of variations of that practice, the one that we're going to do now is what's called the full body breath practice. That is simply noticing any sensations anywhere in the body associated with the in and out flow of the breath. And the emphasis in this practice is one of relaxation, to really maintain a relaxed body, relaxed mind. Just keep relaxing without falling into dullness, of course. Let's do that practice now. Let's do a 15-minute meditation. We begin by setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. A vigilant posture is to keep the back nice and straight. And at the same time, allow the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. And having established a good posture, then to keep the body as still as possible, avoiding any unnecessary movement. And allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. Simply allowing the breath to flow naturally and effortlessly. And preparing the mind, setting it into a state of relaxation, stillness, and clarity. Simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment, releasing all activities of the mind, and just rest, resting in that stillness, the stillness of the present moment. And maintaining a relaxed body and a relaxed mind. Now bring your attention to the sensations of the breath throughout the body. Simply noticing any sensations in the body associated with the in and out flow of the breath. And maintaining an ongoing flow of mindfulness of the sensations of the breath throughout the entire cycle of each in and out breath. And with an emphasis on relaxation. On each out breath, relaxing and releasing any tightness or tension. And on each out breath, releasing any thoughts that may have arisen. Now, if you get distracted from the breath, no need to get frustrated or upset. In fact, be happy you've noticed you've become distracted. And the very first thing to do is simply relax. then release the distraction, and then very gently return to focusing on the breath. So relax, release, and return each time you become distracted. Simply keep coming back to the breath again and again, patiently and happily. And we can bring the meditation to a close. Let's start with a short review. In this program over 3 weekends, we're focusing or using as a basis for our discussions this article, Mental Balance and Wellbeing, written by well-known Buddhist Alan Wallace and a well-known psychologist, Shauna Shapiro, where they're trying to build bridges between Buddhism and Western psychology by introducing a fourfold model of well-being that introduced the idea that if we are striving for inner well-being, then we need to cultivate these 4 types of mental balance of motivational, attentional, cognitive, and emotional balance. And in the article, they propose a model of 3 types of imbalance in each one of these areas we need to correct. There is deficit, meaning not enough, hyperactivity, too much, and dysfunction, wrong type. And so therefore we end up with this model where we first begin with the motivational or cognitive balance. On that basis, then we can engage in attentional balance training. On the basis of attentional balance, we can engage in cognitive and emotional balance. So in other words, from a Buddhist perspective, the foundation is the preliminary practices. On that basis, engage in Shamatha practice, and that forms the basis of both Vipassana and compassion practice. But we saw that in this model, and also from a Buddhist perspective, that it's not a serial process. It's not like first motivational balance, tick, then attentional balance, tick, then cognitive emotional balance, tick. Is that each one of these areas that we cultivate will actually support and enhance the other 3. So it's not a strict linear system. Although there is some reason, of course, that they're in this order, that first we need to begin to develop these reality-based desires and aspirations for our own and others' happiness to give us a direction. Once we start to get that, then we can start to engage in attentional balance training. Once we start to get into some attentional balance training, then we can start to begin to engage in cognitive emotional balance. And then as we deepen in each one of these 4 areas of mental balance, it will enhance and support the other 3 areas. So if we have an integrated approach, that's going to be most effective in gaining mental balance and well-being. And we saw there that cognitive, or here we're calling this motivational balance, entails intentions and volitions that are conducive to one's own and others' well-being. The imbalances here, deficit in this context of motivational was to apathetic loss of desire for happiness. And we remedy that by meditating on the realities of impermanence, suffering, and the possibility of generating well-being. That even though we may be in a state of suffering at the moment, this is impermanent, transient, things can change, we can improve. And to understand that the source of happiness and suffering is not out there, it's within ourselves. And therefore it is possible to attain a state of well-being and therefore overcome the deficit. And hyperactivity, we remedy that obsessive desire, chasing after pleasure, by cultivation of contentment, understanding that those pleasurable experiences are never going to satisfy us and fulfill us. They're not source of genuine happiness, and thereby overcome the hyperactivity. And then overcoming dysfunction, we remedy that with experiential recognition of true causes of suffering and well-being. And we saw that in the Buddhist perspective, we can do this by these preliminary practices called the 4 thoughts that turn the mind. That by reflecting on this precious human life full of opportunity, that will aspire us to make our life meaningful. And in addition, to reflect on death and impermanence, to understand this precious opportunity not going to last forever. So we've got to take advantage of it while we have it to make our life meaningful now. And then to reflect on the causality of our actions, and therefore inspiring us to, at the foundation level of making our life meaningful, adopting an ethical lifestyle. And then at the deeper level, reflecting on suffering and its causes and happiness and its causes. to understand that the underlying source of suffering is not out there, it lies within our own mind. It's our mental afflictions at the deepest level, our distorted view of reality. And that the source of happiness is not out there, it lies within our own mind. It lies within cultivating those three higher trainings of ethics, concentration, and wisdom. And thereby, through these practices, we can achieve that state of genuine happiness and well-being. And so then through these preliminary practices, then that will establish the basis for the other three areas of cultivating mental balance and well-being. And so that brings us to the second of the four types of balance, that is attentional balance. And here in the article, it says attentional balance is the next mental factor discussed because attention is a necessary skill for achieving the final two factors, cognitive and affective balance. Without the ability to sustain attention, it is difficult to closely examine people's moment-to-moment cognitive and affective processes. Or in other words, from a Buddhist perspective, without practicing shamatha, it was going to be very difficult to get anywhere in vipassana or compassion training because our mind is not focused, it'll be distracted and dull. And so it'll be very difficult to make progress in those two areas of practice. And so that's why this attentional balance comes second in these four types of mental balance. Again, the article says that attentional balance is the ability to sustain a voluntary flow of attention with a quality of awareness that is suffused by ease, focus, and clarity. And so here with attentional balance, we can talk about these three types of imbalance, of deficit, hyperactivity, dysfunction. And here deficit with respect to attentional balance is, the article says, is characterized by the inability to focus vividly on a chosen object. In Buddhism, this correlates to laxity or dullness. We're not focusing clearly on the object. Whereas hyperactivity, says, the article says, occurs when the mind is excessively aroused, resulting in compulsive distraction and agitation. Here in Buddhism, we often talk about the fault here of excitation. And then dysfunction, it says, the article says, with respect to attentional balance, is when people focus on things in afflictive ways, those that are not conducive to their own and others' well-being. So this dysfunctional attention is actually something that we correct in the other three areas, particularly the motivational balance, but also the cognitive and emotional balance, that afflictive ways of attending we deal with in each of those three areas. So here in attentional balance training, we are mainly focusing on overcoming deficit and hyperactivity. And that's what the article goes on to say. He says these imbalances of laxity and excitation are remedied through the cultivation of mindfulness, which is defined in many Buddhist texts as sustained voluntary attention continuously focused on a familiar object without forgetfulness or distraction. And metta attention. And metta attention, sometimes I think in psychology is called metacognition. Here in Buddhism, very closely related to this idea of introspection, which we'll look at shortly, which is the ability to monitor the state of the mind, swiftly recognizing whether one's attention has succumbed to either excitation or laxity. So mindfulness is to be able to hold the object, and then metta attention here, or introspection, is quality control, noticing if we are falling into deficit or hyperactivity. In other words, noticing if we're falling into laxity or excitation. And so let's have a look at this attentional balance training within a Buddhist context. And this is often referred to as shamatha training. What is shamatha? Shamatha is a Sanskrit term which we can divide into two parts. The first part, shama, means calm, a mind that is not discursive, and ta means to remain or abide. So often shamatha is translated into English as something like calm abiding, meaning not only a mind that is calm, but it's abiding, i.e. focused single-pointedly on an object. So shamatha is the practice of cultivating a calm, clear, focused mind. In other words, it's a concentration practice. And so why is the shamatha practice important? Here, this is attentional balance. This is improving our attention skills. And certainly in an everyday life perspective, this shamatha practice or attentional balance is very important. Because if we haven't got any attentional balance, we're not very effective in anything we do. So if we improve our attention skills, we'll be much more effective in everything we do. We'll have much better mental balance, meaning much less agitation, stress, and so forth. And instead of being the slaves of our own mind, often caught up in our distractions and agitations and so forth, we'll become the masters of our mind. And now, because our mind is so agitated and distracted and so forth, we often have a lot of sleep problems and even sometimes some physical health problems. And so if we improve our attention skills, then we often end up with some physical health benefits as well, better quality sleep and maybe even some improved health conditions. But here we're talking about these 4 types of mental balance in terms of gaining a state of genuine happiness or well-being. So we're talking here about the pursuit of genuine happiness, and that this attentional balance training or shamatha training is crucial. To strive for genuine happiness, as I think I briefly mentioned in the last session, in all Buddhist systems of practice, we come down to the same 3 core areas of practice. That on the basis of an ethical lifestyle, avoiding harmful behavior, we engage in this concentration or shamatha practice to develop our attention skills, to develop single point of concentration, which then we apply in the wisdom or vipassana practice to gain direct insight into nature of reality, to overcome our distorted views, mental afflictions, and thereby overcome all of our suffering and achieve liberation from suffering, and thereby achieve this state of genuine happiness or inner well-being. And we saw that in the article here. It said, attention is a necessary skill for achieving the final 2 factors of cognitive and affective balance. So not only is attention skills or shamatha training the basis of vipassana training or cognitive balance, but also compassion training, that to be able to cultivate those positive qualities of loving kindness, compassion, and so on, we need attention skills. We need a focused mind to be effectively do that. Let's have a look at now how we engage in shamatha training in terms of shamatha meditation. Here, as with all meditations, preparation at the beginning of a session is important. Preparing body, speech, and mind, which we looked at a little bit in the meditations earlier in this first session and in the meditation we just did. Preparing the body was to set the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, vigilance. Relaxed body, vigilant posture, keep the back straight, and then allow the body to remain as still as possible. So the body doesn't cause any problems in the meditation. We can set and forget the body. And then speech is all about inner speech, and we can help to subdue that a little bit by simply allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. That will subside the inner chit-chat somewhat. And then to prepare the mind, setting the mind in a state of relaxation, stillness, and clarity. Bringing the mind into the stillness of the present moment, remaining relaxed and clear. And then preparing body, speech, and mind in that way, we can effectively engage in not only shamatha meditation, but any main meditation practice. Here within shamatha training, developing our attention skills, there's 4 things we'll be looking at here very briefly. What qualities are we cultivating in this training? The qualities of relaxation, stability, clarity. What objects should we use in this training? We're going to mainly look at the breath now, but also next session we'll look at using the mind and awareness. Then what tools we use in this training, the 2 tools we just briefly saw, mindfulness and mentioned metta attention or metacognition, or here in Buddhist perspective called introspection, and the 2 imbalances of deficit hyperactivity, or in other words, laxity and excitation. So let's have a look at each one of those 4 elements now in Shamatha training: the qualities, objects, tools, and imbalances. And again, the attentional balance, it says, is the ability to sustain a voluntary flow of attention with a quality of awareness that is suffused by ease, focus, and clarity. And so therefore, there are 3 qualities we're cultivating in this training, in this practice. The first of those is relaxation. Very important, particularly for us in the modern world, because we tend to oscillate in the modern world between 2 extremes, that when we're alert, we tend to be tense. And when we're relaxed, we tend to be quite dull. And so it's impossible to develop sustainable attention skills with a lot of tension. We know from our own experience, if we apply a lot of tension to focusing, then we get very exhausted if we have to focus for a longer period of time, and often our mind becomes very agitated. So therefore, if we really want to develop attentional balance effectively and sustainably, the first thing we need to do is cultivate the quality of relaxation, which we emphasized in the earlier meditation in this session. Then we work on improving stability of attention to overcome, here in the article talks about hyperactivity, or Buddhist perspective here, excitation or distraction, getting pulled away. And then on that basis, we can work on improving the clarity of attention, overcoming what's the deficit in attention balance, or in other words, laxity or dullness. And here, there's a quote from the recommended reading for attentional balance training, The Attention Revolution, from Alan Wallace. He says, the relationship among these 3 qualities can be likened to the roots, trunk, and foliage of a tree. As your practice grows, the roots of relaxation go deeper, the trunk of stability gets stronger, and the foliage of vividness reaches higher. And I can't overemphasize this point enough through my own experience in talking to many people, developing attentional balance, or the Shamatha practice, the importance of first establishing the basis in relaxation. Because if we push hard with a lot of tension in this training, then the tree of Shamatha will fall over, because we haven't first sunk deep roots of relaxation. Sinking deep roots of relaxation, that will support this strong trunk of stability, overcoming excitation. The stronger the trunk of stability, the higher the branches and leaves of clarity can grow. What objects should we use in this training? Here in the article that we're using, it says, one of the most widespread Buddhist practices for developing attentional balance is mindfulness of breathing. In such practice, one may begin by focusing the attention on the tactile sensations of the respiration wherever they arise in the entire body. That's the practice we just did, the full body breath practice. This is very good for working with relaxation. Then 2, one may then more narrowly focus on the sensations of the rise and fall of the abdomen with each in and out breath. That's the meditation we're going to do shortly. This is very good for enhancing stability of attention. And then 3, in the most highly focused exercise, the attention may be directed to the sensations of the passage of the breath at the apertures of the nostrils, so the entrance of the nostrils. This is very good for improving clarity of attention, because here we're bringing the attention up and we're focusing on a smaller area. Very good for enhancing clarity of attention. And we'll be looking at that. We'll be doing that meditation at the beginning of the next session. What tools do we use? So here in the article, it says that the imbalances of laxity and excitation are remedied through mindfulness. And here they use the word meta-attention, or metacognition, or in Buddhist training, it's often called introspection. So mindfulness, as the article says, is defined as sustained voluntary attention continuously on a familiar object without forgetfulness or distraction. So and mindfulness in Sanskrit is smrti, in Pali sati, and those words literally mean to remember. So mindfulness is our ability to remember the object, our ability to hold the object, to not forget it, to not become distracted. what we need to realize is that in some modern day mindfulness traditions, the word has been redefined slightly. And often in modern mindfulness traditions, it's been redefined to mean something like a non-judgmental awareness of whatever is arising in the present moment. Very good thing to do, but this is not really how the word mindfulness in the Buddhist perspective context was defined. And so here we have an example of a modern way of defining the word mindfulness from John Kabat-Zinn from his mindfulness-based stress reduction. He says, mindfulness means paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. We need to be aware of this difference in usage of the word mindfulness to avoid any confusion. So that's the first tool we use, the mindfulness to hold the object, to focus on the object, to not forget it, to not become distracted. But then we need the second tool, in the article calls it meta attention, basically monitoring body and mind. In other words, quality control. In Buddhist perspective, this in Sanskrit is called samprajanya, often translated into English as introspection. And so we're monitoring our body and mind. So it's a quality control, monitoring mindfulness. How are we going? Are we still focused on the object, or are we starting to fall into dullness or distraction or laxity or excitation? This word samprajana in Buddhism sometimes is in English translated as alertness or vigilance, which I think is not very precise, because introspection is always looking inward. Whereas alertness and vigilant, we can be alert or vigilant to things outside of ourselves. So introspection, I think, is a more accurate translation for samprajanya. So these are the two tools we use in this shamatha training. And then the two imbalances, the deficit hyperactivity. Here in the article, it says, while the attention is mindfully engaged with the respiration, one metacognitively monitors the meditative process. In other words, quality controls, introspect, monitoring, how are we going? Noting as swiftly as possible the occurrence of either laxity or excitation. And then, of course, if we notice we're falling into laxity or excitation, dullness or distraction, the article goes on to say, when laxity sets in, the primary remedy is to arouse the attention by taking a fresh interest in the object of meditation. And that is that the reason is that because the most common reason we fall into dullness or drowsiness is we've simply lost interest in the practice. As with anything in our life, if we're watching, for example, watching a program on TV at night and it's not very interesting, we're going to probably get very dull and drowsy and maybe even fall asleep. Whereas if it's a very interesting program, we'll be very much focused our attention on the program. Similarly here, if we really refresh our interest in the practice by understanding the importance of this attentional balance training, this shamatha training, we'll be very enthusiastic to do this practice. And so therefore, if we find ourselves falling into laxity or dullness, here, the first thing is to do is refresh our interest in the practice. We see down the bottom of the slide on the right, then restore our attention on the object and retain that ongoing flow of mindfulness. So falling into laxity, to remind ourselves what to do, refresh, restore, retain. Whereas the article says, whereas when the mind becomes agitated, the first thing to do is to relax more deeply. Because often when our mind gets agitated, excited, distracted, we get frustrated and we tense because we think the reason we get agitated and distracted is I didn't clamp down hard enough on the object. So we clamp down even harder. So we don't want to do that. So when our mind is agitated, tense, distracted, first thing to do is to relax. Then to release the distraction and very gently return to the object without clamping down more forcefully. So simply relax, release, and return. And so the article then goes on to say, in this way, the attentional balances of laxity and excitation may be overcome. And so that brings us to the meditation. We'll go to the second variation of mindfulness of breathing, that is focusing on the area of the abdomen, focusing on the rising and lowering of the abdomen as we breathe. This is very good for improving stability of attention. But remember to maintain the basis of relaxation, not to tense in trying to improve stability of attention. And what we're going to do partway through this meditation is we're going to experiment with counting the breath. You may find this helpful to enhance stability of attention, because if you find that you're getting distracted a lot, you just keep coming back and you get distracted again. You may find counting the breath helpful to improve stability of attention initially. Because if we are counting the breath, we are occupying our mind with something related to the breath practice. So there's less opportunity to get our mind caught up in other distractions. But this is not part of the standard practice. It's a short-term remedy. And so there's a cost benefit with this counting the breath. The benefit is that by counting the breath, it may help us to stabilize attention a bit. But the cost is we're adding some conceptual activity to the practice, which means that as we get deeper into the practice, instead of the counting breath helping avoid distraction, it'll just become another distraction. But in the initial stages, you may find it helpful. So we're going to experiment with it in this meditation and see if you find it helpful in avoiding distraction. Many ways of counting the breath. What we're going to do in this meditation is we're going to count at the end of the in-breath, 1, and then focus on the sensations of the breath on the following out-breath, the following in-breath. At the end of the next in-breath, mentally note 2, and we're going to count 1 up to 10, and then go back to 1. If at any time you lose the count, you go back to 1. But this is not simply mindfulness of counting. The main object is still the sensations of the breath, the sensations of the rising and lowering of the abdomen as you breathe. And just at the end of every in-breath, mentally note the count, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. But we'll bring that in partway through the meditation and see if you find it helpful to improve stability of attention. Let's do that practice now. Find a nice comfortable posture. Let's begin. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. Using the out-breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. And with each out-breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. And simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. allowing the mind to remain relaxed, still, and clear. And now, whilst maintaining that basis of a relaxed body and a relaxed mind, bring your attention to the sensations of the breath in the area of the abdomen, focusing on the sensations of the rising and lowering of the abdomen as you breathe. And maintaining an ongoing flow of mindfulness of the sensations of the breath throughout the entire cycle of each in and out breath. And monitor that mindfulness using introspection, noticing if you're falling into either laxity or an excitation, or in other words, falling into dullness or distraction. And if you find yourself caught up in any agitation, tension, or distraction, then first thing to do is relax. Then release the distraction and very gently return to the breath. So relax, release, and return each time you become distracted. Or if you find yourself falling into laxity or dullness, then refresh your interest in the practice. Restore your attention on the breath, and then retain an ongoing flow of mindfulness of the breath. So refresh, restore, and retain. Let's now introduce counting the breath to see if it helps to stabilize the attention. Remember, at the end of the in-breath, mentally note 1, focusing on the sensations of the breath on the following out-breath, the following in-breath. At the end of the next in-breath, mentally note 2. In this way, counting from 1 up to 10, and then going back to 1. If at any time you lose the count, simply go back to 1. So let's now experiment with counting the breath to see if it helps to stabilize the attention. And we can bring the meditation to a close. Got some time for question answer. So if you have any questions, put it in the chat and then Nitsan will read them out. So do we have any questions yet?
Tal asked before, I find it difficult to concentrate on the breath and it gives me a feeling of hyperventilation, and I prefer to concentrate on a single pointed visualization. Is it less effective for shamatha training?
Very good question. The breath is, and we'll look at the objects, we'll actually look at some variations that are possible for objects in the next session. I'm going to talk about some other possibilities. However, the breath is probably the most widely emphasized one in many Buddhist traditions, for a number of reasons, which we'll look at in the next session. But unfortunately, particularly it seems like in the modern world, we try to control things, you know. We like to have our life in control. And so we try to control things. And one of the things that we definitely have some control over is our own breath. And so therefore, when we, in this practice, focus on the breath, there can be this tendency to control it. Because sometimes we feel like I have to make my breath rhythmic or subtle or shallow or something. And so then we sort of force the breath in a certain way, and then we can have all sorts of unwanted consequences, maybe even hyperventilation, as you mentioned. But one very common thing in using the breath as the object is somehow people, whether they consciously or subconsciously, are trying to breathe less because they feel like they need to make it more and more subtle. And so then what happens is at some point in the meditation, people go, because they're not breathing enough. So that's a sure sign that we're sort of controlling the breath. So if we notice any sort of control of the breath, just release that, release that, release that, release that. So that's one point. The second point is a visualization. Yes, in fact, in some Tibetan Buddhist traditions, the object that is highly recommended for this practice is a visual image of a Buddha, the Buddha, very virtuous object. And also it sets ourselves up well for Tantra practice later, where there was a lot of visualization of Buddhas and deities and so forth. So no, the short answer is you don't have to use the breath. There are many options, and we'll look at some of those other options in the next session. Any other questions?
Anat is asking, how do we cultivate contentment?
With respect to the motivational balance, I imagine.
From the earlier session.
Yeah. Contentment, again, if we have to shift our worldview. As long as our worldview is that the source of my happiness is coming from out there, we're never going to be content. We can try to be content, but it's a losing battle. So what if we do this reflection that we saw in the preliminary practice there, if we really deeply reflect on the fact that the source of happiness and the source of suffering is nowhere out there to be found, it lies within our own mind, then that's going to help us to start to have some contentment. But intellectually understanding that's not going to be enough. Intellectually, we may already understand that those things we chase out after there are never going to give us any lasting, genuine happiness. You know, many of us intellectually understand that already. That's not going to make us content. It might be, if we keep bringing that to mind, that probably would help us to be a little bit more content. But to really practice contentment, we need to bring intellectual understanding into experience. We need to experientially see that the source of happiness is nowhere out there. To be able to bring those intellectual understanding into experience, we need to reflect on in those preliminaries on those points with a focused mind. Hence, attentional training will feed back into the motivational balance, or in other words, shamatha will feed back into preliminary practices. That the more we practice shamatha, the more calm, the more clear, the more focused our mind is. If we then bring that mind into those preliminary practices where we're doing these reflections on precious human life, death, and so forth, then those ideas will start to penetrate. They will become more experiential. And then, for example, we'll start to experientially see more, experientially, that those things out there are not the source of our happiness. And therefore, will lessen our craving and attachment to them, and less chasing after those sensory pleasures, and therefore therefore contentment will naturally follow. Another question?
There is another question from Miri. How people who struggle with attention deficit disorder, ADD, who find it very difficult to concentrate, can succeed with shamatha practice despite repeated failure in concentrating.
With things like ADHD, there can be many factors that lead to those condition, and environmental, genetic, dietary, I mean, many factors. And I think that if we have, because the two imbalances here are deficit hyperactivity, if they are excessive, if we're clinically diagnosed as ADHD, then I think we need to tailor this attentional balance training to be more effective at that level. And if we're very severe level of ADHD, you may actually initially require some medication to bring you to a minimum level. But then on that, and of course, medication's never going to solve it, but it may help initially get you to a level where you can begin to start to use these sorts of training. But certainly in that regard, probably what's going to be very helpful is if you can find a therapist, psychologist, or someone who has ability in this training to tailor it to specific needs of ADHD, for example. So if you have severe ADHD, just to jump in and do shamatha practice, you may find that too big of a gap to be able to effectively use shamatha. Again, you may find there may be some medication necessary initially, moving on to more practices that bridge the gap into the shamatha practice, and eventually doing shamatha practice. And I've talked to a number of people who've had not only ADHD, but things like depression and so forth. And they have used this sort of regime to overcome the need for medication or greatly reduce medication, in that through a trained therapist who has some skill in this sort of training, to go through those stages to be able to get to a point where we can then maybe directly use these practices as described in the Buddhist context. But certainly with this mindfulness, I think not only ADHD, but in terms of depression, anxiety, and other clinical problems, I think there's been a lot of work being done now in very specific therapies, cognitive-based therapy and so forth, to help you to use mindfulness to bring people through that to a level where then they can effectively use these practices directly. So that's what I would recommend in this specific case. And then in addition, to try to determine what factors are contributing to the ADHD, because certain factors we have some control over. Unfortunately, one of the, I think, big factors in modern day ADHD is diet, particularly sugar. I mean, way too much sugar in our diet. So that's something certainly we can have some control over to improve our diet and so forth, and exercise and so on. So these sorts of things I think are also very helpful in dealing with ADHD. If there are factors, environmental, dietary factors and so forth, that we have some control over and can work with, that would be also very helpful.
Okay,
Any more questions?
thank you.
We've got time
Maybe
for one more
last,
question.
yeah, maybe
Last
last
question.
question from Tammy. I think Alan Wallace talks about vase breath. Can you please explain what it is?
Yeah. Vase breathing is a breath manipulation practice, and it's a practice that comes in the level of tantric practice, and there is a number of variations of that vase breathing, and the sort of gentle version, which he actually sometimes teaches, you can use, and is sometimes mentioned in some shamatha texts as a preliminary to meditation at the beginning, preparing body, speech, and mind to bring the mind into a good state. So, but the full-blown vase breathing is actually something that we should not attempt unless we have a qualified teacher and we're practicing at that high level, tantric level, because it can, if done incorrectly, can really unbalance subtle energies in the body and therefore unbalance the mind as well. But the gentle vase breathing, which is a little bit of slight breath retention, just sort of working with the abdomen a little bit, is a preliminary practices in the context of shamatha to help to calm the mind, to prepare the mind for shamatha practice. Okay, that's it. We've run out of time, so let's stop there. So in the next session, we'll continue on with this attentional balance training, the shamatha training, and I'd like to look at another shamatha practice that personally I find very powerful and very helpful for many of us in the modern world, this practice of resting in awareness. And we'll be looking at that practice along with having a look at these two imbalances of laxity and excitation, a little bit more detail, the levels of them and how to overcome them. And we'll be looking at some various different objects to use in this attentional balance training as well. So that's all coming up in the next session. But let's take a 30-minute break now, and I'll see you back in 30 minutes for the last session today.